Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. Happy to be back with you again. My name is Dave. You can fill in the blank. Your name is? Ding. Happy to have you here. I want to talk to you today a little bit about podcast host tips if you have an interview-based podcast. I've been compiling some stuff from some podcast friends, getting their insight from their perspective on what it's like to be a podcast host for an interview show, some things they've learned, some things they do differently or better now, and I'm going to compile them all into one episode, share them with you, save you some time and a little bit of grief. Here we go. How to be a great host on your podcast with guests. Being a host of an interview-based podcast is so much fun. You get to meet some of the most amazing people in the entire world. I look through past episodes of my shows, and I can name off for you people who have changed the way I think, have given me wisdom, shared their knowledge with me and with my audience. And I've built some really great friendships that go beyond the episode into real life, which is what I love as a podcast host. So I've kind of gone through and talked to some of my podcasting buddies out in the space and said, hey, what have you learned about your podcast and your process, and what have you learned about your guests and how to treat your guests as a podcast host for an interview-based show? So I've compiled all of their feedback and all their ideas, and I'm putting in one big episode just here for you. So if you're thinking about being a podcast host for an interview-based podcast, or you're going to have the occasional guest on your show, this is a perfect episode for you to learn from others in this space. You ready? Okay, here we go. So one of my friends on podcasting, this is what he does, and I've been doing this as well. After you've recorded and you've published the episode with your guests and you moved on, you will notice that your guests will still be posting on Facebook groups and elsewhere that they're looking to go on shows. So they'll put an ad up saying, hi, I'd like to be a guest, and here's what I do and who I am. Anytime you see those posts from one of your past guests, be sure to go down into the comment, like, do the heart, whatever, but then leave a review for that guest on their post as they're looking for other opportunities. Leave something of value. This is an amazing guest. They brought value. They were really easy to interview, a great conversation, super kind person, a benefit to your show, and leave a review right there in the comment sections for their post for the other podcast hosts to go, wait a minute, that's interesting. So do that. It really works well. It's a great connection with you and keeping that connection fostered long after the podcast has gone out. Leave comments on any time your guest asks to be on another show. Add value to your guests beyond the episode by doing that. Another thing you can do is to realize that you do not have to take every single invitation from guests to be on your show. You are the host of your podcast. You are in charge of the content on your show. So you do not need to take every single person. And I've done that in the past as a newer podcaster, trying to make sure I have an episode for next week. I would, at times, take people onto my show and I'd be done and going, there's just something about that episode that doesn't really sit with me. And some of those episodes I've not released because it didn't go the way I'd expected. And it didn't bring value to my audience. So I didn't release it. So if you don't want to do that hard decision after you've recorded, then a pre-interview and some background work will help you eliminate maybe a guest that doesn't fit with your audience, your plan, and your podcast. So do your research up front, and you don't have to say yes to everyone. Do you have a pre and a post show plan for each of your podcast guests? Do you have a plan? I do pre-interviews with everybody, so I get a chance to meet and talk with them, get to check out their tech, everything, before we have them on the show. That's what I do. But do you have a pre, which is what I'm talking about, or a post as well, plan for your guest? Are you giving them artwork and social media assets they can use to promote the episode? Or what's your communication like after you hit stop on your recording? You need to put some time and effort into that as well. So What's your plan? Do you have one? No? Then you need to create one. You need to start that right away. That pre-interview, you can also call it a planning session, is very beneficial in the fact that you get to talk about the podcast, answer any questions. Think about meeting a podcast guest who's never been a guest before. Think about the amount of questions that they're going to have for you as a host, that they may be nervous. They don't know how this works. They don't know what they need to do or how they show up, or do I sound okay? Like, there's so many things they're battling with as a new guest that a pre-meeting, a planning session, a pre-interview, whatever you want to call it, can definitely help to soften that and create a safe space for your guest to be featured on your show. So put the time in, invest it in your guest up front by having that planning meeting before you hit record. When you come to your recording of your podcast, make sure your guest is comfortable. If you're not going to be releasing video footage of your podcast, you're an audio-only podcast, which I recommend for new podcasters. You can always do video and live and blah, blah, blah later. But audio only, let your guests know that this is an audio-only podcast. I will not be releasing the video from our episode if we're recording on Zoom, for example. Some people don't want to have their video out in the world, and you need, as a host, to be aware of that. So be careful and make sure they understand that. Let them know that this is not live if you're not recording live in front of an audience, that editing is your friend, and if there's a mess up, if there's a mistake, anything can be fixed. So let them know that up front so they can take a drink of water during the interview without feeling guilty. They can think about their answer before they answer, and all that will be fixed in editing. Okay, so audio-only podcasters, listen to me. Be sure you let your guests know kind of the ground rules of the recording, and as well, let them know this isn't live. We don't have to be perfect, and that we can work on this together. Okay? Make your guests feel comfortable every time they come on your show. One of my friends in podcasting lives by this. He says, treat people well and the results will follow. I love that. Treat people well and the results will follow. Your guest coming on to promote their book, you having on somebody on your show to promote their thing, focus on them and let the results fall in behind. We're not here for the results first and then the guest second. It's the guest first every time. Results will follow, okay? A parent guru who thinks that Facebook is the best place in the world for podcasting and a bunch of other things, which I struggle with, he said to never put the name of your podcast guest in the title of your show, which sounds counterintuitive in that the idea for an interview show is that you interview people. So my guest name are the first thing you see in every episode because it's about my guest. It's not about me. And that's just my approach for my podcast. So be sure to include your guest name in the title, in the show notes, and links to all of their stuff so that people can find them after the podcast. It's all about my guest. Okay, so name in the show title. Yes, please do that. When reaching out to your guest, one thing I would suggest as a host is to have a communication packet with 3 things included that you can give to your potential guest. Number 1, a synopsis of your show, what's your show about, how long it's been around, that kind of stuff, a little brief history, and who are we talking to? Number 2, the reason why you believe that your potential guest would be a good fit for your show. Make sure you include that. And number 3, the benefit that your guest will receive by being on your show. Beyond the recording, beyond having an episode that they're a guest on, what else do they get? Maybe access to your community on Facebook, maybe future promotion opportunities, maybe you'll help connect them with other podcasters. Maybe you'll help connect them with other people in their area. So there's other opportunities beyond just being on your show that could be a benefit to your guests. Make sure you let them know what those are and include that in your emails back to your potential guests. I do this one quite often. If your guest during your interview mentions a tool, maybe an author, maybe a musician, somebody out there that's inspired them, a company that they work with, a publishing company that they write for, a mentor, someone they look up to, use that information and then go after who they mention and invite that person onto your show, that company onto your show. So if I have somebody come on to my author podcast and talk about an amazing author that inspired them to start writing, I take that content, I go to that other author that was mentioned and say, listen, person A on my show said that you are their inspiration. I would love to have you on my podcast to further that conversation about you and how you've inspired this guest that I had recently on my show. That's really interesting for a potential guest that I've been requested to be on your show because of what someone else said about me. That's amazing. The other thing you can do is if somebody, one of your listeners, suggests a potential guest, ask that listener to provide you questions to ask that potential guest that they recommended to your show. Now it's not about you as a host, but it's about Samantha, who recommended this author. Samantha has a question for you. She's the one that suggested you be on the show. Samantha's question is, and that's just a great moment for that guest, where Samantha can ask the guest directly the question that would just light them up if they heard an answer from their favorite person on your show. So try it. Keep a running list of all of your past guests, whether you've moved forward with them or you haven't. You've reached out and maybe they've ghosted you. Maybe they were a good fit. Maybe they weren't a good fit. But keep a running list. And for me, I take all the information I collect through Calendly, which would be the name of my guests, their email address, their website, any notes that I put into the calendar invite. And I put that into a Google Sheet, and I can sort through and I can get all of my guests' emails are in one location. And then I have columns that track whether the interview has happened, whether an invite has gone out to my guest, the recording has happened, has it been released, on what date, have I done my social media posts, have I posted to YouTube, have I sent them a thank you email. I have trackable columns that keep me on task for my guests. And when I look at a post from a potential guest and go, that name sounds familiar, I can go to my Google Sheet and go, wait a minute, that was the guest that stood me up 2 years ago and never came back. So it kind of helps you to filter out maybe bad experiences in the future by people who really wasted your time. So a Google Sheet, great way, track all that information and keep in touch with that. And you can get as much detail from your guests as you want for that, birthdays, whatever, and then you can send them messages as well. So Google Sheet, track all your guests. It's really a great way to stay on task and to stay organized. And lastly, and I'm going to put this as a shirt on my TeePublic page, that I really believe that podcasting is about them, not about me. Okay, so as a guest coming on a show, the podcast opportunity is about my audience that I'm speaking to. As a host, the podcast is about my listener, not about me. Okay, keep that in mind. Podcasting is not about you, it's about them. And you can fill in the blank as to who them is, your guest, your audience, whatever. But your podcast is not about you. Please stop making your podcast about you. That is self-serving and it doesn't help anyone in the long term. We want to be here for our guests. We want to be here for our listener. That is why we do what we do. So again, just some tips on podcast hosting, how you can be a better podcast host on an interview podcast for your guest's sake and for your audience's sake. What have I missed? I want to know from you. What have I missed? What can I add to this list from your perspective? If you're a podcast host and you have guests on your show or you're thinking about it, I'd love to get your feedback. howtopodcast.ca is the website. And even in this specific episode, there'll be a little question that pops up as a question here attached to this episode. Go ahead and answer that question. I'd love to get your feedback there as well. Works really, really well. And would love to get your information and your feedback on the show and your thoughts. Thanks for being here on the How to Podcast series. More ones coming up. I'm going to do another episode of this, but now from a guest point of view, in reverse of this episode, from a host point of view. And that'll be the next episode coming up next time here on the How to Podcast series. Thanks for listening. Get out there and find a great guest for your show.